Welcome to Red Star, a show about the revolutions and counter-revolutions that have shaped our world. My name is Pavel Vargan, and today I'm thrilled to welcome an exceptional writer, a writer for whom I have a lot of admiration, a member of the Qiao Collective, which is a diaspora media collective dedicated to challenging US aggression against China, and I don't know if you like the term, but a longtime activist. Charles Shu, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Pavel. It's a huge honor.
Great pleasure. I have a lot of questions for you and a lot of things I wanted to discuss, but before we do, I wondered if you could give a general overview of why Taiwan is so contentious, because my sense is that even people who are very emotionally charged on this question don't have a very clear perspective on what the history is and what the political background is.
Yeah, absolutely. For those who are interested in exploring that particular subject at greater depth, I would say much greater depth, we have a very comprehensive timeline and resource list on the issue of Taiwan and cross-state relations that we published all the way back in February, and it's still near the top of our website, as well as a somewhat condensed version of this in the July-August issue of Monthly Review on the Indo-Pacific. But in a nutshell, I would say that a lot of the contention today, right, surrounds these mainstream Western narratives that portray Taiwan in the current moment, right, as they love to call it a vibrant democracy. They love to associate like that adjective in particular with it, right? And they frame it as such in contradistinction, of course, to its big bad giant authoritarian neighbor, mainland China, or in the parlance of the Taiwanese separatist movement, simply China, right? And this is a seemingly subtle point that actually gets at a profound and actually quite recent historical revisionist project that now has achieved near hegemony in the Western discourse, namely of taking the current situation of political separation between Taiwan and mainland China, and in some ways like reifying this into a trans-historical and deeply rooted, almost cultural or quasi-ethnic separation, right? This, in terms of the prevalence of this discourse, it's actually a fairly recent development, because in the Cold War, right, the situation that you had was these two rival regimes in Beijing and in Taipei, right? Both, the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, respectively, both of which actually claimed, to be the legitimate government of all of China, a unified China, right, including both the mainland and Taiwan, and both of which, identified in their own ways with this common lineage of a shared Chinese history between both sides of the strait. Even though, in other respects, these two sides had fought a bitter civil war, which resulted in the victory of the communists on the mainland, the retreat of the nationalists or the Kuomintang to Taiwan. The political systems, their geopolitical orientations in the Cold War were polar opposites, essentially. But there was that sort of shared understanding, right, between the communists and the nationalists on the question of Chinese unification as the ultimate goal, and in fact that was in many ways inherited from their common origins, right, in the Revolution of 1911, which inaugurated the Republic of China, and in their history of fraught but still meaningful united fronts, right, against feudalism and imperialism, especially Japanese imperialism. So what has happened in recent years is that the now ruling party in Taiwan and its social base, right, reject those historical precepts. They have sort of elevated, this social distinction between various different waves of Chinese migration to Taiwan over the course of its history, right? In particular, before the Japanese colonial period or during it, and the more recent wave after Taiwan's retrocession to China in 1945, into an almost quasi-ethnic difference, right? A cultural difference, a linguistic difference, and have essentially tried to assert that Taiwan has been transhistorically separate from China, right? And this is in the service of their project of actual Taiwanese independence. And I think that understanding this history is extremely important in terms of cutting through a lot of the Western propaganda, which has become nearly hegemonic in the mainstream media that we have the misfortune of being subjected to here, because they pretty much accept that narrative hook, line, and sinker, right? And it's all in the service of this very dangerous project, right? Of making permanent like a political separation between Taiwan and mainland China, which in terms of its material reality, right, the political separation of the two has been historically pretty much entirely the result of colonial projects or neo-colonial projects, right? First of Japanese colonialism starting in 1895, and then since 1949 of U.S. neo-colonialism. And unless we want to establish a precedent that regardless of the tectonic shifts, right, on both sides of the strait, it's acceptable to reify what is historically and currently an effort by the United States to carve out and essentially balkanize like a part of an enemy country, right, whose current government came to power through a socialist revolution, then I think everyone on the left needs to stand against this project.
Thank you. And that leads us really nicely to the discussion that I was hoping we could have, which has to do with that piece that you wrote, which is called The Gates of the Great Continent, Palestine, China, and the War for Humanity's Future. A really masterful look at the ways in which, or at the functions that both the Zionist state and Taiwan serve in the imperial playbook, but also at the ways in which the Chinese process of liberation and the Palestinian process of liberation have been in dialogue with one another. And you begin your piece with two quotes, which I think are worth repeating here. The first is from Mao Zedong. The second is from Ghassan Kanafani, roughly around the same time, 1965 and 1972. And Mao says, "Imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and Formosa, that is Taiwan, are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same." Then a few years later, Kanafani says, "Imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution." Now, of course, they were writing in a time when the states of Eastern Europe were still within the socialist bloc, where the political orientation of those states was very much internationalist, was very much connected to the Third World Project. And we may very well now add the states of Eastern Europe to that political equation. And in fact, there are tremendous similarities in the kind of thinking by US strategists around, say, Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, in terms of these areas serving as bridgeheads for capital accumulation, for political and cultural expansion in their respective regions, and really serving as different points for the continued encirclement of the Eurasian landmass. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very important figure in the U.S. Government throughout the Cold War, a Polish-American strategist, wrote this book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. And he said, the United States, for the first time in its history, has the potential to gain, and I quote, "unlimited access to this hitherto closed area." And by that he meant the Soviet Union. And he said, an important piece on that grand geopolitical chessboard, which can secure that access, is Ukraine. And we're seeing the consequences of that policy now. We're seeing the consequences of U.S. imperial policy in Palestine and in the broader region. And so, what I wanted to ask you is, what is the common thread, especially when you think about Palestine and Taiwan? What's the common thread that runs across this geography of imperialist expansion, of imperialist aggression in these attempts to encircle the Eurasian continent?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there already, in terms of a common playbook that is deployed locally in to the situations, and also the way that imperialism viewed as like an active and subjective force, right? In a way that both Mao and Kanafani, I think, evoked quite remarkably. Um, uh, like it's coordinating its strategies in all of these places, right? Around a common, I would say, geostrategic understanding that is informed by this idea of Eurasia as like the heartland, right? As the world island, in the words of the premier sort of imperialist geostrategist, Halford Mackinder, right? Whose sort of control, or control of which, right, then becomes the linchpin of essentially world domination. And this is quite explicitly the logic under which Brzezinski was operating as well, right? Um, and so I think that uh, one common thread then is simply the strategic location, right? Which has been borne out historically over centuries, indeed millennia, of these three locations, right? Palestine, as the sort of crossroads of Asia and Africa, Ukraine in many ways as historically a transit route, like for attempts to invade and conquer Russia, right? And then Taiwan, for centuries in its history, being used essentially as like a colonial or commercial entrepot by various powers, right? Used or coveted by them, whether the original Dutch and Spanish colonists in the 1600s, or later Japan, mostly in the early 20th century, right? And it's used as a launching point, for attacks and attempted invasions of the Chinese mainland. And I think, in the case of like the strategic location of Palestine and Taiwan in particular, right, and the very intentional implantation of these, in various senses, like foreign regimes, right, that take the names of Israel and of the Rump Republic of China. There's actually very like remarkably similar language that's being used, across these different cases. In particular, both have been described by sort of high level U.S. strategists as unsinkable aircraft carriers. In 1950, like pretty much at the very start of the Korean War, in a memo to President Harry Truman, where he was arguing essentially for conjoining, right, the political separations of the Korean Peninsula and of China, right, between the mainland and Taiwan, and first making the latter permanent, right, by sending the U.S. Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. General Douglas MacArthur, argued, quote, "Formosa in the hands of the communists can be compared to an unsinkable aircraft carrier." And then 30 years later, Reagan's first Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, said, quote, "Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one American soldier, and is located in a critical region for American national security." So, remarkably similar language there being deployed, to emphasize the strategic location of these two, right? And then in terms of the modality of colonial or neo-colonial control of these areas, the way in which, like, the Israeli settler colony is like a deeply alien foreign imposition, I think is like quite obvious to us, to our listeners. I don't really need to go into detail on that. It's a little bit more subtle in the case of Taiwan and of modern day, especially post-Maidan Ukraine, I think. But there are still some commonalities to be drawn out there. Um, in that I think that the actual, you know, motivating ideology, right? That is intended essentially to galvanize like local support for, respectively, anti-China and anti-Russia projects in Taiwan and Ukraine, respectively. Is essentially drawing on the implantation, at the very least, of a uh, uh, like a foreign ideology, right? In particular, this like really fetishistic attachment to specifically, Western bourgeois liberalism, um, but also, like I would say, uh, like underlying ideological projects and projects of historical revisionism, right? That are in many ways attached to historical or former like colonial metropoles in a very insidious way, right? So in the case of the Taiwan separatist movement, this would be sort of like elevating and whitewashing the period of Japanese colonial rule, right? As actually like a marker of distinction that uh, you know modern day Taiwan separatists like hang on to as in fact an indicator of their relative modernity, right? And their relative advancement compared to the benighted and backwards mainland under communist rule. Um, and likewise in Ukraine, right? You have this revival of a really insidious nationalist ideology, stemming from that of World War II era collaborators with the Nazis, right? Um, and in each case, uh, this can be, or we can draw parallels between this and the actual ideological precepts of Israel and of the Zionist project as well, right? In that, like, it from the very beginning was working in active cooperation with European anti-Semites. There's a lot of documentation of the sort of contemporary World War II era Zionists, like actual collaboration with the Nazis, right? Um, and so you have in all three places like an underlying ideology and and like historical narrative, right? That completely sort of whitewashes these colonial relationships, these historical colonial relationships that gave birth to the current political order, and essentially folds them all like very forcibly into a flattening narrative that like Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan are these sort of forward bases or bastions of democracy in the face of their savage and or authoritarian, and in all cases like somehow more Asiatic neighbors under which they're under constant threat, right, of you know elimination or incorporation into this undifferentiated monolith of Eastern despotism.
Yeah, and that's, I want to pick up on that because one of the things that I've really been thinking a lot in the context of Eastern Europe, and I think it probably applies a lot more in the case of Taiwan as well than it does in the case of Israel, where you do have a bunch of white European settlers in Israel, right? That's not true of Ukraine, and that's not true of Poland, and it's not true of Taiwan. But what's interesting to me is this question of race and this question of whiteness, of who's allowed to be white. Now, when Poland was a socialist country and half of Berlin was a socialist city, basically everything to the east of Berlin fell within that monolith of, Eastern despotism of the Reds, of the communists, without necessarily any differentiation. But then as we joined NATO and acceded to the crimes of empire, we all of a sudden became white. And now the river Dnieper in Ukraine separates the freedom fighters from the orcs in the eyes of a lot of the West. Even though we know from very recent history that those classifications, when they're issued by the colonizers, effectively are very tenuous, right? Osama bin Laden was a freedom fighter before he was a terrorist, and it's a kind of designation that can just as readily be given as it can be taken away the moment you cease to collaborate in that project. And that dynamic of not only certain parts of Eastern Europe being considered Western above others, but also over time, their own self-identification with the Western project, and the kind of entrenchment of, as you said, those kind of Western bourgeois values has been very destructive for I think our whole region, and but a very interesting phenomenon to observe.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pick up on that point, I think the very conditional nature of incorporation into whether whiteness as a racial project, or the West as a geopolitical construct, right, or both, is also a common thread, running between all three examples, where in many ways this like, in addition to the dynamic in Eastern Europe, where it's perhaps like the most obvious, you've had in these historically very anti-Semitic Western, sort of particularly Euro-Atlantic societies, right? This like two processes like occurring in parallel of the sort of collective incorporation of Jewish people into this conception of whiteness, right, of Judeo-Christian identity, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, right, like occurring very much in tandem with the Zionist project and with the entrenchment of Israel, particularly after the 1967 war, into, like, very firmly into a Western bloc, right, and its essential elevation as like a proxy or a forward base for Western interests in the Middle East. And likewise, if you look at how this plays out in, not just in Taiwan, but in East Asia generally, right? There, it's not so much incorporation into whiteness per se, but there certainly is this discourse of, in particular, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, right? This exceptionalization of the three, who are like actually bound together by their status as like historical or current, like actual bases, right, for U.S. Imperialism, and certainly their subordination as vassals to the U.S. imperial project. But the way that this is sort of laundered, right, in cultural terms, is that these are free Asian democracies, right, with relatively more westernized political systems, and in the case of Taiwan in particular, the sort of separatist historical narrative there is one that, like, tries to project this backwards in time, centuries, right? Like, saying like we've always had this, like, very distinct democratic spirit, and this is attached in very strange ways, again, to like a whitewashing of colonial crimes, not just by the Japanese recently, but going all the way back to a sort of almost celebration, right, of the brief Dutch and Spanish colonial periods in the 1600s. So yeah, like a lot of like very insidious ideological work being done, in all three regions, right? But I think deriving from a common playbook in terms of really cementing, like, the long-term, like, ideological basis for essentially like permanent subordination, right, of all three, an incorporation of all three into like Western imperialist objectives.
So I want to turn to the question of China's relationship with Palestine, and maybe a nice way to get into that is by reference to this wonderful thread, and I'll share a link in the comments on this video, posted by Tings Chak a few days ago, who's the art director at the Tricontinental Institute. And it was a thread of art made in China by various people, various members of the public, in solidarity with the struggle in Gaza. And the people of Gaza as they face this genocide. And what really struck me is that a lot of it explicitly made reference back to the brutal 8-year war of resistance against Japan, where Japan carried out atrocities similar in magnitude to, in fact, at in absolute terms, greater in value in scale than what's happening in Gaza. And so I wanted to ask you if you have a sense of what China's own experiences with genocide and resistance to colonial imperial domination, or whether you can say something about the ways in which those experiences color for the Chinese people their own response and their own perception of what's happening in Palestine today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is within the realm of art and of sort of visual parallels, often being drawn quite explicitly, right, between the scenes of devastation that we see coming out of Gaza, right? The bombed out, essentially moonscape, right? That the urban landscape has been turned into. Obviously, the images of human devastation as well, right? In the midst of this genocide, and strikingly similar images, coming out of Chinese cities under Japanese siege or Japanese occupation, right? During the war of resistance. This is the level at which I think Chinese people, sort of historically and today, have at the popular level, experienced the greatest sort of affective solidarity, right, with the Palestinian cause is through that shared historical memory. And I would say that it instantiates in sort of other ways as well, right? Like that, has both historically and today been the most common basis, I would say, um, for solidarity at the popular or demotic level. But in terms of the actual very substantial strategic and diplomatic and material support that has been offered by China from the Mao period, right, to the cause of Palestinian liberation, and also the particular forms that assistance has taken, right. I think that's been informed, in quite specific ways by the experience of the war of resistance against Japan as well. In one of um, the sort of articles that I use as a source for mine, right? This piece by Lillian Harris from 1977 on China and the PLO. She points out that, quote, despite great differences, the Palestinian arena is the Arab world situation which comes closest to fitting the Chinese experience of revolution against an imperialist invader, right? So, there you have a particular identification of Palestine, right, and its struggle, as in some ways not entirely unique within the Arab world, but the starkest example of this at the time in the mid '60s, very recent memory, right, of prevailing in an extremely long grueling struggle that was anchored in guerrilla resistance and people's war, right, to imperialist invasion. And in terms of the specific forms of China's engagement with the PLO at the time, and now with both the PLO and with various Palestinian resistance factions, some of which are outside the PLO structure, I think that you have certain other parallels that are really informing this. In particular, if you look at the Beijing Declaration that emerged from this joint meeting of 14 different Palestinian factions, running the gamut essentially from Hamas and Islamic Jihad to Fatah and the PFLP that happened in Beijing in July, right? The common thread there, with China's own sort of experience, first of national liberation from Japanese imperialism, and then of social revolution under the leadership of the communists, was the necessity of unity, right, of the national forces, right, operational unity, in many ways military unity, as a precondition, right, simply for liberation from imperialist rule, and for consolidation of sovereignty over the entirety of one's actual national territory, before like embarking at a truly massive scale on a project of socialist revolution, right? And this is something that I think this is not really stated explicitly, but I think it's very much the Communist Party of China drawing on its own quite involved history of sort of alternating between periods of sort of purge and civil war, right? And of people's war waged against the Chinese nationalists, and of forming or like alternating between that and united fronts, right, with the nationalists, in some ways like subordinating their own structures to those of the nationalists in the interests of national unity against a greater common threat, right? So the clearest example of this being precisely the War of Resistance, when they joined the United Front with the KMT, but in every appreciable way, maintained their distinct identity, and were in fact in a better position, at the end of the war than to complete the process of the revolution, right? And I think that this is the same logic that's motivating the Beijing Unity Declaration among the Palestinian factions. And then another parallel, I would say, is even though this is not necessarily foregrounded so much today in Chinese diplomacy, right, on account of both the PLO's normalization with Israel and through the Oslo Accords, and how that opened the door to its allies, including China, normalizing with Israel around the same time in the early '90s. But historically speaking, right, and I think now, especially in the wake of the obvious failure of Oslo, right, and of the so-called two-state solution, um, you know, you can see repeated confirmation of the limitless territorial ambitions of a settler colonial project like that of Zionism, right? Or of a project of unrestrained imperial expansion like that of Japan, where any sort of concession that you make to it, right, like tactically or otherwise, will only encourage further expansion, further aggression. There can be no like permanent peace with part of your land like you know occupied, right? Um, and this obviously has been an operative logic since the Nakba, not just in Palestine, but in historic Palestine, but outside of it as well, right? As you can see in Lebanon, with the like very clearly stated ambitions to annex and to settle southern Lebanon, right? And then historically as well in the Golan Heights, in the Sinai, right? And this project of Greater Israel, in its most sort of grotesque dimensions, and then very similarly, just drawing on the experience of China vis-a-vis Japan, right? There were like after the 1931 sort of initial Japanese invasion of Manchuria, right, of northeast China. You had certainly many voices of conciliation, right, that said, okay, like maybe they'll just be satisfied with northeast China, right, and they'll allow us to preserve some measure of sovereignty over the rest of the country. And the continuous line that the communists pushed, right, was that no, like this has to be confronted, right, like the we in fact need, a measure of national unity here, even with our bitter enemies, in order to beat back this invasion, or Japan will be um, enabled, right, as it certainly was in 1937, to expand this into a general effort to conquer and subdue all of China. And uh, yeah, so that ultimately was the argument that prevailed, but it certainly took a lot of strenuous effort, among the various national forces to achieve a measure of unity around that, particularly with Chiang Kai-shek, at the head of the nationalist regime, uh, treating the internal threat of communism as, in fact, a higher priority until he was quite literally kidnapped and then forced to abandon that, right, in 1936, just in time to form a united front to confront the greater Japanese threat. So, there are all these parallels, right, that even when they're not drawn out explicitly, I think, are motivating at sort of like a higher or more macro level, strategic sense. The way that China approaches the question of Palestinian national liberation, but I think this works in a complementary way with the deep, affective popular ties that the Chinese people have with the Palestinian cause, because of this shared imagery, and because of this deeply ingrained shared understanding, right? That these are colonial projects that are genocidal in intent and in actual practice, and that they must be firmly resisted by all means necessary.
You touch on this dialectic that I think is so central to the tradition and the history of internationalism, which is, on one hand, the necessity of people who are oppressed of coming together, right? The conditions of shared oppression bringing people together, but on the other hand, the existence of a positive project, the idea that a victory in one place can become a boon for victories or struggles elsewhere. And you cite, I just want to read a few lines of this beautiful poem that you cite in your piece by Abu Salma, a Palestinian poet. He writes, "We have fought the same fight. We have endured the same suffering. Now we're in Beijing. We can spread our wings and fly. The strong people here all have sprouted wings." And that's fantastic. And in a much more material sense, if you read these documents that the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, published in the 1960s, the late 1960s, they are actively learning from the experiences of people who fought similar struggles before them. And there's a fascinating chapter in this document on the strategy for the liberation of Palestine, which talks about what it means to confront a technologically superior enemy. And I was really struck by that, because they are talking about Vietnam. They cite Vietnamese generals. They look very closely at Vietnamese strategies, and you can see echoes of the Vietnamese victory in Gaza today. You can see the use of tunnels on a terrain that's flat and on a terrain that's easily penetrable by enemy forces. You can see these tactics in which small groups attack and then retreat wherever they know that they can secure a small victory, to gradually grind down the morale of their enemy. So again, you see the Vietnamese victory live on in the Palestinian struggle, which is a very beautiful idea, which, as I said, is, I find, central to the internationalist project more broadly. But I also know, and one of my favorite pictures is the picture of Palestinian revolutionaries reading Mao on their break. I know that there are many books from the Chinese revolutionary tradition that became canonical in Palestine. And this idea of a popular cradle strategy of organizing with the masses, of being among the masses, but also other things. And so I wonder if you could say a few words about the ways in which Chinese thought on revolutionary organization, revolutionary strategy, has directly influenced the strategies of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, both in the past, and because you hinted at what it is today, but also to some extent in today in the way that the struggle is actually being waged on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've touched on a lot of these already. I have sort of an entire like I think the longest chunk of my article actually is devoted to drawing these parallels, and I'm not really making a strong claim there per se that it is directly from Mao's writings on guerrilla warfare that today's Palestinian resistance and its regional allies and acts of resistance are like drawing the sort of minutiae of their like tactical thinking, right? But I do think that of course, like Mao was historically one of the like like canonical authors, and thinkers and actual practitioners of guerrilla warfare, right? To the extent that a lot of his ideas, I think, have diffused into a general kind of shared praxis of guerrilla movements. In the period in the 60s and 70s, when China was in fact directly training, a lot of like PLO guerrilla fighters, these articles that I referenced, cite a number of specific, pieces by Mao, right? Like above all others, on protracted war and on guerrilla war, right? That were in some sense part of the curriculum for these delegations of Palestinian representatives that were dispatched to China, right, for training. And so I was sort of inspired to look through these and to pick out, I think, some of um, the passages that are at the very least most strikingly um, emulated, whether intentionally or not, right, or put into practice. In some cases, at like a more sophisticated level than we in fact, you know, than in fact were technologically or otherwise possible, right, at the original time of writing by Mao himself, but within the Palestinian liberation struggle today, right. So you named in particular this idea of the popular cradle, which really comes organically out of over a century of Palestinian resistance, and it's essentially, the idea that like, society at large, right? That the lifeways and the sort of common cultural matrix and cultural practices and that the masses themselves build should be in every way materially, ideologically and otherwise built in order to sustain the resistance, right. That there should be a common like consciousness and understanding of what resistance means, right. And that in fact like this popular cradle is necessary to its eventual success. And when I read about this for the first time, courtesy of my comrades in the Palestinian youth movement, I immediately thought of Mao's famous dictum that guerrillas should move among the people, essentially as the fish in water, right? And this image, not necessarily intentionally, it suggests a sort of like more passive role for the masses, being likened to water than this much more active conception of the popular cradle that exists in the Palestinian tradition, right? And so I think of that as almost like a complementary dictum for the masses, right, for the people, on how to best sustain the resistance. While for the guerrilla fighters themselves, right, like Mao's dictum essentially is the starting point for more specific rules of behavior, right, in terms of really embedding yourself among the people, in terms of these practices of the mass line, in terms of like genuinely practicing people's war, right, and like elevating and advancing the people's interests as the basis for the struggle. And I think that this is something that has been actualized in every theater of the Palestinian liberation struggle historically. You can think sort of in the armed struggle days of the PLO, right, the 60s through the 80s, of how in particular refugee camps, right, in Jordan and then in Lebanon, in Syria as well, right, were quite literally like were popular cradles for resistance formations that could use them as sort of external base areas, right, from which to build a culture of resistance, a shared memory, right, of the lands, the villages, right, from which they or their ancestors have been so violently expelled, um, and and then particularly from the time of the first Intifada onwards, a real implementation of that idea of the popular cradle, within occupied Palestine itself, right? In different ways, right? Even within 48 Palestine in some respects, as we saw in the Unity Intifada 2021, but certainly throughout the West Bank, right? And particularly the steadfastness of the resistance and of the popular cradle surrounding them in the northern West Bank, right? Like in these refugee camps in Tulkarem and Jenin, um, and then virtually the entirety of the Gaza Strip, particularly after the so-called Israeli disengagement of 2005, right? And then Hamas's subsequent victory in the elections and their securing of that democratic legitimacy within the Gaza Strip, which enabled its transformation into essentially a giant popular cradle for resistance at a scale that was not previously practicable, right? So I found that to be a very compelling parallel at the very least. And I've made some reference to this as well, right? But this idea of Gaza and before it, various refugee camps both in and outside of occupied Palestine as also base areas, right? That too is something that whether intentionally or not seems very much to draw on the practice of the Chinese Revolution, right? And its sort of conscious efforts to implant and to practice at a mass scale, these social policies, right, of the mass line of land reform and of thereby building, a really durable mass base for the revolutionary project within certain strategically located bases, right? And yeah, I guess the final like passage from Mao that struck me as very relevant to the present day struggle was on encirclement and counter encirclement, right? And the way that we see this actualized, in the Gaza genocide today is that even as like the Zionist project and its American backers have sort of systematically acted throughout the decades to deprive the Palestinian struggle of its sources of strategic depth in areas immediately surrounding historic Palestine. For example, through normalization with Egypt and Jordan, through the suppression of the Black September uprising in Jordan, through the absolutely brutal Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon, in particular South Lebanon, in the 80s. Like even though that has acted to isolate Gaza as a base of resistance and as a mass popular cradle for the resistance in a way that is very intentionally like intended to enable something like the blockade that we saw for a full 17 years prior to October 7th, right, and which was in many ways a slow genocide already. You had at the same time, the construction of this regional alliance, right, incorporating Hezbollah in Lebanon, incorporating Ansar Allah in Yemen, incorporating the Islamic resistance in Iraq, and then sort of behind them all, the Islamic Republic of Iran as kind of a bulwark, right, and as a source for the development and the free sharing of methods of asymmetric warfare that could then be emulated and further further built upon by all these other forces, right? But acting in some ways to counter encircle, the encirclement of Gaza by Israel and its proxies, um, which we've seen very much actualized, right, in these sort of coordinated support fronts that have been launched by various elements of the axis of resistance throughout the course of this war. And so, yeah, like those, I guess, are some specific examples that I laid out, at least in my article, of modes and practices of guerrilla warfare that at the very least I'm seeing actualized, in the practice of the axis of resistance today. Whether how direct of a line there is there, right? Is not really a question that I explore. I think that, like, to really delve into it likely would take a lot of digging into the primary sort of Arabic literature, which I unfortunately am not equipped to do. But I am aware, in terms of the diffusion of specific tactics, right, like of tunnel warfare, for instance, that there is something of a direct line going from its initial deployment at a mass scale, by the Communist Party in the war resistance against Japan, to then its deployment at an even larger scale in Korea, right, during its own war for sovereignty against U.S. aggression, and then to Vietnam. And from there, I am at the very least aware of, like, a direct line that goes from North Korean assistance to Hezbollah, right? In terms technical and other expertise going into their practice of tunnel warfare, really starting all the way from the period of the Israeli occupation, but coming to a head in their fantastic successes in the 2006 war. And from there, a lot of those same practices of tunnel warfare diffusing then to Hamas in Gaza, and that, of course, has provided a kind of substitute for the strategic depth that they otherwise and favorable terrain that they very much otherwise lack, right? And it's really that, as well as the popular cradle, which Israel is seeking to exterminate, quite literally, throughout Gaza, and in particular in its intensified form in North Gaza, right? Those two in tandem have been the real bases for the ability of the resistance there to hold out for over a year of this genocide, and to really humble the far technologically superior Zionist war machine before the eyes of the world.
And that point, the last point you made about the popular cradle, I think is really key. There is a dark corollary to the necessity in a revolutionary project to build the kind of unity in society that would generate, that would give rise to a popular cradle. And that corollary is that the claim of the occupier that everyone is a potential enemy, in fact, has a rational basis. Max Seil, who was on the last episode of the show, makes this point that colonialism is not something that just happens incidentally. It's integral to the capitalist project, because the instruments of colonialism secure the theft of land from the people that live on it, exterminate or enslave or otherwise use the would-be defenders of that land as cheap labor, and then extract the resources from that land. And to achieve that, you need to pacify or exterminate that population. And if there is a revolutionary project which is seeking to unify that population, then, in fact, from the perspective of the occupier, the entire body of the colonized becomes an obstacle to that project, which is why it is impossible to conceive of any kind of settlement that involves peace between the Zionists and the Palestinians. The only path forward has to be liberation, because these two positions are so deeply contradictory and bound by such profoundly different rationality that it's a total fantasy to suggest, even as many people still do, that a two-state solution is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think in terms of the residual attachment, right, to this idea of a two-state solution, and the ways in which it, continues, at least in rhetoric, to be um, a shared sort of framework for the approach to the Palestinian question in international bodies like the UN, and indeed, by China itself, and still by much of the global South, right? It I would describe this less to as some people characterize it, like a betrayal of the Palestinian cause, right? Than to than as sort of a historical holdover from the limited, but at the time it seemed like quite enduring success of the Zionist counterinsurgency, right, in actually coupling the carrot to the stick, and in actually like breaking apart this national unity around the intended project of liberating the land from the river to the sea, right, which they were able to, which the Zionists were able to attain through Oslo, right, through this this promise of eventual mutual recognition, right, and of independent statehood on a a fraction of the original territory, um, which then paved the way, right, for uh, something like 25 or 30 countries, which had been stalwart allies of the Palestinian cause, right, but channeled through the PLO as a vehicle because of its designation as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, right, to then sort of follow it into normalization. And in a way, we're still living with the legacies of today, right, in terms of like um, like a much more sort of fragmented geography of resistance, right, between like within historic Palestine, between Gaza and various parts of the West Bank, right? Also its own divisions between zones A, B, and C, East Jerusalem, 48 Palestine, um, which has been written about so eloquently, for example, by Walid Daka, right, as an instantiation at a mass scale of this kind of searing of consciousness, and this um, intentional project of trying to like quell and differentially sort of suppress the belief in the very possibility of resistance in different ways, and through different colonial modes, right? We see the effects of that in some ways magnified to the world scale in terms of the differential approaches of various actors in the global South that historically have these very strong ties with the Palestinian cause, right, because it was so emblematic in this age of mass decolonization and national liberation, as like a crucible, right, and as sort of the example par excellence of like in like truly anachronistic, like modern day like settler colonial project and of the resistance to it. And so I think that like or my hope at the very least, right, is that the developments that we've seen since October 7th, in terms of a much um, more broadly based, shared commitment to resistance at a popular level, right, in various parts of historic Palestine and in the diaspora, is something that we can then see reflected as well, right, in terms of a gradual, right, but ineluctable shift, like within these structures that bring together, various states and social movements in the global South, right, towards a much stronger position on, uh, the what Palestinian liberation actually looks like, right, and on its fundamental incompatibility with Zionism than we've seen so far.
You talked about China's China subscribing to the two-state solution, and that's often brought up as one of many examples of China not doing enough. A lot of people make that claim that despite the rhetoric, China is not doing enough. And I put this to a Marxist scholar in when I was last in Shanghai, We had a long conversation about this, and he told me that you will never see the Chinese state today use the word internationalism, but that doesn't mean that its actions can't be interpreted through an internationalist Marxist lens. And he made the point that the world of the Third International, even the world of the Third World Project, is gone. The struggle for formal decolonization, with many critical examples, Palestine being chief among them, has largely been supplanted by the struggle to fill the shell of political liberation with economic sovereignty. And so that requires a very different political orientation, especially considering that the balance of power in the world has undergone a tremendous shift with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So all of these things coming together, he said that China's structural role in the global economy and in the international system can be interpreted in internationalist terms. Now, you already talked about the Beijing Declaration, the bringing together of the Palestinian factions. But what are some of the other ways in which China's foreign policy and its economic engagement in the region has affected the capacities for regional struggle, or have shaped the conditions for resistance in West Asia?
Yeah, I think that that was a pretty profound insight by your interlocutor in Shanghai, right? Even some of the more striking examples of like formal Chinese interventions on this question, for example, in the international legal sphere, right? That people have taken note of. For example, when the Chinese representative Ma Xinmin at the International Court of Justice, like intervening on the question of the legality of Israel's occupation, right, in the West Bank and Gaza, kind of strayed a little bit from that brief, right, and actually like affirmed repeatedly the legitimacy of armed resistance, right, and the need to distinguish it from terrorism. Those are obviously very welcome comments, right? And the thing is, though, that they were still grounded ultimately in a kind of legalistic framework, and one that actually was drawing on, this this inheritance, from the high tide of national liberation, right? When the UN General Assembly, as in its capacity as sort of an international lawmaking body, because there were so many newly sort of decolonized, newly liberated countries, like they were able to actually embed within the structures of international law, this legacy of their own armed and sort of unarmed struggles for national liberation against colonialism. And in some ways, it was drawing upon that legacy insofar as it has been instantiated within something that we can call like a world order, right, in which China, in contradistinction to the role that played through many of the Mao years when it was excluded from the UN, right, and really for a lot of that period only enjoyed diplomatic recognition with with global South and third world countries. Yeah, like at that time it was is sort of acting less to try to stabilize this world system than to overturn it, right? But nonetheless, I think what we're seeing today in terms of China's overall orientation, right? It's like now sort of ironclad defense of these principles of non-interference in the sovereign affairs of different countries, right? Of like a commitment to resolving disputes through diplomacy, right, and through really adherence to the letter of international law, while it rhetorically and in many cases materially is a profound shift. It's one that in the present moment, right, actually puts like the gigantic economic and diplomatic heft of China, right? Like a China that has grown, like in economic and geopolitical strength so much, during the reform period, especially behind a world order that, in fact, is or behind a vision, right, of a multipolar and actually rules based international order that stands increasingly in direct contradiction with what the United States and its vassals, including the genocidal settler colony of Israel, call a rules based international order, right? And as that contradiction intensifies, you know, in a sort of paradoxical way, I think that um, the inclination of China to act as more of like a stabilizing influence, actually in practice uh, renders it, more and more a bulwark and a counterweight to U.S. hegemony and to the actually existing imperialist world order. In such a way that even though its engagements are predominantly diplomatic, right? We can think, in addition to the Beijing Declaration and all these efforts to shore up national unity within the Palestinian cause, we can think of the regional situation, right? The rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was brokered by China last year, and which paved the way both to a tenuous ceasefire in Yemen, right? But one that has enabled Ansar Allah to really step up as in some ways the most independent actor within the axis of resistance, and the one that may arguably be most sort of punching above its weight, right? Um, but also, like in very crucial ways, like creating space, even for these reactionary, Gulf monarchies that historically have been so tied at the hip to Western imperialism, right? Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, to begin to at least take more independent stances, right? Um, and certainly, to deprive the United States of its desired use of those countries as like staging grounds for war against Iran, and that then brings us to the relationship between China and Iran, right, which has been cemented with this, extended 20-year sort of $400 billion trade agreement. And in other ways, has really, I think, enabled Iran, right, to pursue with comparatively much greater freedom, right, albeit still under like an extremely brutal sanctions regime, a project of sovereign like technological development, right, and in particular, a really extensive, indigenous sort of like arms manufacturing capacity, which it then has been able sort of freely to outsource, right, and to share with its regional non-state allies within the axis of resistance. And without that firm sort of like military backing, right? I think we would see like a very different picture in terms of the level of cohesion between these different support fronts, right? That are all behind the principal struggle in Gaza itself. Um, and yeah, like I think like as a backstop, right, to Iran as the main sort of anchoring member of the axis of resistance. China materially, I would say, is playing its biggest role there, right? And we can see this as well, as part of to tie it back to the very beginning of this conversation, right? As a refutation of the advice and the expectation of Brzezinski, right? In that same book, warning against this possibility of a tripartite, uh, you know, like alliance of sorts between China, Russia, and Iran, right? Which then with the combined heft of those countries, and with their shared commitment to ending U.S. hegemony, right? Then essentially constitutes this like much more populous and much larger alternative pole embedded within the heart of Eurasia, right? Against these projects,
Yes.
by the empire and by its most violent proxies to hegemonize the great continent of Asia, in Mao's words, right, and thereby the world.
Yeah, and the actual quote from Brzezinski's book is really fantastic. He says, the greatest threat to the United States is a grand coalition of the countries you listed, bound together not by ideology but by shared grievances. And in fact, what we're seeing, which I think is really a kind of grand historical irony in the history and the history of the imperialist countries, is that they are in many ways the authors of what's happening. Right? From the 70s, you had the old imperialist countries, the US, Europe, to a lesser extent, and Canada, but UK, Japan, Europe, the US, really start to integrate and escalate their economic and military aggression against the third world, the global south, through instruments like debt, through the weaponization of the dollar, through sanctions, through overt military aggression, through capital exports, all of these different tools to try to secure or re-entrench their domination. And what we're seeing today is that every one of those instruments is becoming an ingredient in the West's decline, right? The weaponization of the dollar is producing de-dollarization. The imposition of these sanctions regimes is seeing countries like Russia and Iran and the People's Democratic Republic of Korea and Venezuela and Cuba coming together, putting their heads together and trying to think through what infrastructures can be built to exist, to trade, to engage in economic activity outside of the parameters determined by the Western states, and so on and so forth. And so, to a large extent, if the West hadn't taken these possibly very short-sighted measures, a lot of what we're seeing today wouldn't be happening. I want to turn, since you are in the West, I want to turn to a question of the kind of scale or the scope of the solidarities that are now emerging. One of the things that we've seen historically is that as the contradictions of colonial violence or imperial violence increase abroad in the peripheries, the contradictions also increase in the metropoles. The repression of activists, the repression of protesters, the opposition to the kind of violence increases, and we see that certainly in the case of Palestine now, especially I think in the U.S., where a very big movement has emerged. Movement I think that still is embryonic and might not build the power this time around to stop the genocide, but has certainly had a very, very powerful mark on the political system, which will probably manifest itself in Kamala Harris's defeat in just a few days' time. So there is this really powerful movement, but it can't be said that similar solidarities would be extended to China. Not to speak of places like Donbass, besieged Donbass, or the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, which still exists under crushing sanctions. So I want to ask, as someone who is in the U.S., who is active in these spaces, have you seen a shift in the scope of these anti-imperialist sentiments since the start of the genocide, since October 7th? And are people starting to question the official narratives on China and on other areas, given that the things that we are hearing from the US government and from the US mass media are so blatantly false and so blatantly serve the interests of empire? Will there be attempts to begin to prepare popular movements for possible escalation in China and to harness this moment of solidarity with Palestine, of rising anti-imperialism, to build a really broad anti-imperialist movement?
That is a fantastic question, and it really drives home a lot of certainly concerns and preoccupations of mine personally, and of Qiao as a collective. who like me are almost entirely communists in the Chinese diaspora based in the United States or Canada, right? And therefore, confronting these questions on the ground of the sort of you know occasionally sort of fraught collisions that can occur, between different narratives vis-a-vis China and Palestine within the broader Palestinian solidarity movement, as it, sort of grows to previously unseen heights, but also experiences, heretofore unseen levels of intense repression. You know, which sort of demand the foregrounding of a kind of, like operative unity, right, among all the different tendencies within it, right? Which in some ways like span the gamut of the Western left with with all of its issues and its internal contradictions. So, to get more into specifics, it must be admitted that there is in the U.S. As in the West generally. But perhaps like to a particularly um, uh, hypertrophied extent here in the U.S. a third campus tendency, right? Even within the Palestine solidarity movement, or at the very least that bleeds over right into variously sort of like uh, uh, you know Trotskyist or social democratic or anarchist elements of the broader Palestine solidarity movement and the broader left, which has as its analytical basis this idea that um, U.S. imperialism uh, is not the only and perhaps not even like everywhere in the world like the primary imperial force at play, right? That treats China, Russia, all these other actors that we understand to be counter hegemonic as sort of rival imperial powers, and um, in some ways like two different audiences, right? Like this tendency will have different messages about China's role, right? When it comes to within the Palestine solidarity movement, they will point to examples like China's recognition of and trade with Israel, right? Um, you know, this line that we talked about that China is not doing enough, right? Um, uh, they'll point to various in most cases fairly specious examples of supposed Chinese like complicity in the settler colonial project, right? And the line that you'll hear the most often is this uh, like this very superficial comparison between Palestine and and the condition of the Palestinians under this genocidal settler colonial regime to the positionality of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, right, in Western China. Um, I think a lot of the ideological work for this was prepared by the like really gratuitous deployment of the term genocide to describe the latter situation, in total contravention of the facts. Right, we don't need to get into too much detail there. Qiao, all the way back in 2021, put out its own very extensive resource list about Xinjiang, which I would encourage folks to look into. Right, but in some ways, like in a very insidious way, um, this propagation of the Uyghur genocide myth has sort of cheapened the term genocide, right? In such a way that when we are streaming, when we're seeing this like incontrovertible, and overwhelming, and in some ways, in some days it feels just debilitating, um, imagery, right? Like nonstop imagery of a live streamed genocide in Gaza and in the rest of occupied Palestine. Um, uh, it, in some ways, that word itself, like loses some of its force when used so opportunistically, right? In the interests of imperialist propaganda, and in a way, that still today I think is driving a wedge, right, in the Palestine solidarity movement on, the question of imperialism more broadly, and in terms of developing any kind of shared understanding of the position of China, within a broader sort of anti-imperialist and counter-hegemonic bloc. That said, I think I have detected a shift, particularly among folks who are more newly radicalized, right? Um, that is broadly, in favor, of implanting within the U.S. left more broadly, right? Like at least a more accurate understanding of the centrality of of China and the demonization of China, right? To this broader imperial project, and therefore to the affinities that have existed historically and continue to exist, between China and Palestine. And this is occurring for a number of reasons. I mean, the number of people, particularly of younger generations, just in general, that are experiencing a major rupture in their consciousness in a general anti-imperialist direction has grown immensely, right, as a result of the scale of the Palestinian solidarity movement. So that's just like more people, like as a whole, who are being newly radicalized into this. Um, in particular, they across the board, right, are sort of much more preconditioned to reject mainstream narratives propagated to them by these various mouthpieces for the imperialist regime, right, that we see in mainstream media, like the New York Times, Washington Post, like all of these outlets, right. And that extends as well to, I think, an increased capacity for skepticism about the narratives that they're proffering about other targets of U.S. imperial demonization, including China. And then I think the last element that I want to touch on is, like, what's the real root of the enduring strength of the Palestine solidarity movement, right? Like, and like, why has it been able to sustain itself through this past year and grow to this extent, right? And I think we need to look there to the centrality of the Palestinian, and broader Arab diaspora, right, as the real sort of vanguard of this struggle, and whose movements sort of stand as a direct continuation of generations of their forebears, right, who have maintained within, in particular, the Palestinian diaspora, even in the West, like a very strong, like, shared understanding of Zionist colonialism as, like, the region as the reason for their diaspora condition, right? And therefore, a shared commitment, um, to this project of national liberation, that incorporates the diaspora in a very meaningful way. Um, and that, I think I saw sort of most movingly, probably, in the People's Conference for Palestine that happened in Detroit in May, right? This bringing together of like over 3,000 attendees, predominantly from, like, the Palestinian Arab diaspora in this heartland of the Arab American community, right? Which was quite overtly, like, committed to the cause of Palestinian resistance by all means necessary, right? With the Palestinian youth movement as the vanguard, uh, and which had enough sort of sway, right, that the one Palestinian American member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, was willing to go up there and share a stage with speakers who were, like, quite overtly, like, endorsing, like, Palestinian armed resistance. And when I was there, in my capacity as a member of Qiao, I was quite struck by the level of political unity that has endured there within this diaspora in particular, right, around at least the nucleus for an anti-imperialist consciousness, which I think for PYM in particular is very, like, thoroughly developed into a broader anti-imperialist analysis, right? And one which is very much in line with ours, including on the question of China. Um, but more particularly, like the ability to sustain that over so many generations within the Palestinian diaspora itself, right? And that, I think, is a unique strength and one that we are sort of working within our own respective diasporas, right? The Chinese diaspora in our case, the Korean diaspora in the case of our comrades in Noruto, right? And various other formations. But for us, in many ways, it's much more of an uphill struggle, I would say, because the particular conditions of formation of our diasporic communities are ones where the centrality of imperialism, right, and the like, the truly sort of unmasked, like, genocidal nature of the U.S. backing for these projects is much more obscured. In the case of the Vietnamese diaspora, right, it draws predominantly on on sort of the losing side, right, of the civil war in Vietnam, and the populations that had the most sort of affinity with sort of like Western imperialist understandings, right? And who in many cases like left, at least in terms of this previous generation, because of their anti-communist commitments, right? So that obviously is a very unfavorable environment to organize in, for our Vietnamese diaspora comrades. In the case of the Korean diaspora community, it's a bit more complicated, right? But there's still it's still freighted with a lot of pro-imperialist, pro-Western, um, and in general sort of like conservative ideological baggage, right? And across the various different waves of Korean migration. And then in the case of the Chinese diaspora, we are to begin with sort of divided by the geography of our home regions, right, between the mainland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the political divisions, right, that these colonial or neo-colonial projects have propagated, including within the diaspora. And then there's also the fact that even this more recent wave, right, this post-reform wave of emigration from mainland China, itself, like our parents' generation, my parents' generation, like sort of selectively, or self-selected, right, to include a lot of Chinese people who are quite attached to um, a positive orientation towards Western liberalism, right? And thereby, unfortunately, to a lot of the imperialist ideological substrates of Western liberalism and how it views the world at large, including, in particular, its view of the People's Republic of China and of Palestine, right? So, that conference in particular, I think, led to a lot of reflections on like our own diasporic positionality, on the difficulties of achieving the kind of like mass-based unity that have been so inspired by in our Palestinian comrades, right? Um, but I think that overall, just this overall, um, like profusion, right, and explosion in many ways of anti-imperialist consciousness, particularly within the younger generation, bringing together, like all of these different diaspora communities, has inspired people to like learn more about their own histories, right? And that includes a lot of our newer Chinese comrades, and for them, I think the message that we're putting out, right, about the continued relevance of the Chinese Revolution, of the product of socialist construction that it inaugurated, and that we in Qiao Collective believe is still underway, has found a very receptive audience there. So it's still I would say overall like very much fraught with contradictions, right? With, a sea of various conflicting narratives. But overall, I would say that this moment that we're in is one that has been galvanizing to, you know, uh, uh, like both a much more militant and materially grounded understanding of imperialism, right? A much more broad-based commitment, especially among younger people, to an anti-imperialist politic, and that overall has been hugely favorable to the continued spread of our message and our anti-imperialist commitment, particularly as it regards the continuously escalating U.S. aggression against China as well.
And that work that's been happening both within the Palestinian diaspora, but the work that you've been doing, the work that comrades from Korea have been doing, has been really essential, I think, in building those kinds of bridges. Now, there are a lot of threads that you've started in your last response, from the weaponization of the concept of genocide by imperialism, which is I think a topic that would merit a whole separate discussion, to the position of different diasporic groups, which to me, as a Pole coming from Poland, is also very relevant, because we have a long and storied history of emigres from different historical periods with very different political positions and very different political roles around the world. Of course, to this question of how we take advantage of this moment to really keep pushing consciousness as far as it will go. And I want to ask you a final question related to that, but at a very different register, which is, how did you yourself come to communism?
Yeah, that is an interesting story in of itself. Yeah, my own, in some ways, it would have to start, I think, with elements of my family background. I don't want to go too many generations back, but my parents were both born and raised in Shanghai, and they, in many ways, were part of this first wave, right? That emigrated to the United States, for purposes of higher education, right? In the late '80s, early '90s, and this was a time that, of course, helped to embed within many in their generation of the Chinese diaspora, right? Other international students, a pretty strong attachment to U.S. value system, to this expectation, right, that China continuing on its reform path would end up essentially following the trajectory of the United States, and becoming like a full blown Western style, like, liberal capitalist democracy, right? Expectations that have been very much subverted by the actual course of China's development. But that was the environment, sort of politically and otherwise, for the most part, that I was raised in terms of, I think a lot of, like, broad convergence, right, between the understanding that I inherited, at least from my immediate family, and the understanding that I was getting from, like, hegemonic media, particularly in the '90s, early 2000s, right? About, like, China coming out of this period of, like, Maoist despotism, and like, opening itself up to the world, right? Which really is shorthand for the Western world, and increasingly, moving that direction, or at least that was the expectation, the hope, right? So, all this said, like, I was also raised sort of evangelical Christian, which, particularly in that generation, was like a surprisingly, well, to some surprisingly, like, large fraction of the overall diaspora Chinese population, right? And so that also conditioned a degree of, like, anti-communism. And I think it was that part that I sort of abandoned first, right? But only in terms of, like, trying for some time to accede to, or to assimilate into, a broader kind of, like, social liberalism. Um, one that was still, grounded in, like, hegemonic liberal ideology, particularly with regards to communism, with regards to China, right? And then my opening towards a more radical politic, actually, interestingly, was originally through the vehicle of anarchism. and it occurred sort of in concert with and during sort of like two summers that I spent first in Vienna and then in Barcelona towards the end of undergrad, uh, where you know I went in, I would say, with like a very idealized picture of European social democracy, and sort of came out sort of in community with you know various people that I had met there, right, who were critiquing it, right, like uh, at least in a very local setting, from at the very least an anti-capitalist direction, right? You know, both, like within within Vienna as sort of like a crown jewel of European social democracy, but one that has also been subject in recent years to increasing neoliberal influence, and has always been in some ways like freighted with the legacy of German imperialism, right, and a lot of the attitudes uh, associated with that, and then of course like Barcelona as a center of sort of the you know much more large scale like anarchist experimentation historically, right. Um, but I think I came out of those, like certainly radicalized in an anti-capitalist direction, but with a still very muddled understanding of imperialism, right? As you would expect, given the way that the sort of flattening, like anti-state, anti-hierarchical, like ideological precepts of anarchism actually dovetail like quite well with like liberal anti-communist narratives when it comes to actualizing socialism. So it wasn't actually until I came out to Los Angeles originally for grad school, right, that I sort of found myself um, almost by accident in a relatively small but quite intellectually active community of actual Marxists, right, and it was actually through predominantly like Latino comrades who educated me on the influence of the Chinese Revolution and of Maoism and Mao Zedong thought, right, on their own sort of their own families, like revolutionary history and practice, right, within Latin America, that I came to a dramatically different understanding of like the global role that had been played by the Chinese Revolution as this real like militant pole of anti-imperialism, right? And that was the opening for me to start, on the one hand, like reevaluating at a truly fundamental level much of what I've been taught to believe about China in particular, right, and about the history of the People's Republic, um, and also just in general, right, like delving systematically in processes of both personal and collective self-study into Marxism, right, into political economy, um, and that I would say was the start of my real theoretical like engagement with Marxism at a theoretical level. Um, but that has, of course, to be complemented by praxis, and that really cemented itself, I would say, when I co-founded a socialist organization in grad school, which really combined a lot of these functions of like, continuing sort of collective self-education, right? Among like all of our different members, and open to the broader community as well. Study of both sort of foundational Marxist texts and I suppose like topics, like a truly broad gamut of topics of contemporary significance, including like, repeatedly returning to the questions of imperialism, in Asia, in Africa, and then several occasions, in the Middle East with a particular focus on Palestine, right? Um, and but combining that sort of theoretical study with the actual practice of like anti-imperialist counter recruitment on campus, and also with like working class, particularly tenant organizing within the broader community, right? Sort of uh, embedding ourselves outside this, otherwise often kind of like insular and sometimes hermetically sealed campus environment. This was all prior to 2020, but I think it prepared us collectively in many ways for these sort of compounding like crises and moments of rupture that happened in 2020, right? With the COVID pandemic, with this spike in xenophobic propaganda, and then for the the abolitionist struggle that really erupted with the George Floyd uprising, right? I think we were in good position to respond, and to really uh, like enter into those struggles, as a collective, very effectively because of these years of preparation. And it was in that moment, right, that I decided to reach out to Qiao Collective, which had just been founded in early January of that year of 2020. Um, and one thing led to another. And since then, I've remained very active in Qiao. We've had our own ups and downs, certainly, in terms of our level of activity, our level of output, as I'm sure people who follow us have noted. But as is the case for I think like many anti-imperialist projects, like ours, right? Whether focused primarily on media or on mass base building or both, this moment that we've been in since October 7th has been a major spur, to revive our activity. And it's not a coincidence, right, that after a 2-year hiatus in publishing, we returned to it in a big way at the start of this year, with the publication of my article on China and Palestine, and also with the publication of our Taiwan resource list. So, there's a certain resonance, I think, in publishing those almost at the same time, which we've drawn out in the course of this conversation. But it's also a consequence, I think, of the truly sort of catalytic effect that this moment has had on on all of our shared projects and our shared commitment to anti-imperialist struggle.
Both of those documents will be made available in the description of the video below. Charles, thank you so much for that story, and thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a real pleasure for me too.